I also thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. And just a little bit of honesty check here. When you told your children you're going to come listen to an economist tonight, how many of them said, please, Mommy, can I come too? I do understand the challenges of talking about economics, especially in the evening of a very pleasant day. So I do appreciate your coming. Also, I want to make it very clear. I'm not here to make any recommendations. I'm not here to advocate any particular way to manage Oregon's forests at all. I'm here to do just that, to talk about the relationship between Oregon's forests and the economy, hoping that that information is useful to you as you make your decisions about what you think ought to be done with Oregon's forests. So that's what this is all about. Okay, let's see if Murphy's Law works. And we're ahead of the game. What I want to talk about are just these things. The challenge is, how do we manage Oregon's forests to stimulate economic growth, generate stable high-wage jobs? And that's what most people are concerned about. And that's going to be the first part of my presentation, is talking about those things. The relationship between forests and basically jobs and prosperity within our communities, Grants Pass, Cave Junction, what have you. The second part is going to be talking about benefits and costs. Benefits and costs is distinct from this. That is to say, you can have jobs that are more costly than what the job produces. But economists pay an awful lot of attention to benefits and costs because we know that over time, if an individual or a family or a community or a nation continues to make investments so that the benefits are more valuable than the costs, then you have an increase in prosperity. But if you do the reverse, that your decisions lead to costs that are greater than the benefits, then that's a long-term pathway towards poverty. And so that's why economists pay attention to that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end, certainly. So, what do we know? Just some background here. We know that harvests have stabilized. What this graph shows, beginning on 1986, going over to 2012, and by the way, I'm going to show an awful lot of graphs that other people have prepared. So these aren't numbers that I came up with. I'm trying to tell you what other economists have come up with, and I'm basically here as a reporter for a large part of this. In this case, it's the Oregon Department of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service. And this is total Oregon harvest history from 1986 to about 1994. You see a decline. There are a lot of reasons for that decline. We know that some of them have to do with spotted owls and salmon and ecosystem protection. And 1994 is notable because that's when the Northwest Forest Plan, which governs 25 million acres of national forest and BLM land on the west side of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, was implemented. Since that time, harvests in Oregon have been fairly constant. They went down during the Great Recession, but we're basically talking about 4 billion, right? That's 4,000 million, so it's 4 billion board feet per year. This is what's happened with log exports. And I have this there because an awful lot of people have asked me over time what's happening with log exports. You'll see that the bottom is different. This one is 1961 out to 2012. Really don't care an awful lot about that. Again, let's look over there from the mid-1990s until about 2009, that flat spot. We were exporting about 400 million board feet a year. So we cut 4 billion, we exported 400 million, that's 1 log out of 10. More recently, that jumped up to about 1 log out of 5. And I've not been able to find official numbers, but within the industry itself, some of the trade publications are saying at the end of last year that they expected that last year would show that 1 log out of 2 was being exported. So again, what that says is that if you have a log truck full of logs and it's headed to the mill, that has a very different impact on the economy than if that log truck continues to go over to Coos Bay or Astoria and put those logs on a ship and the logs go to China. Okay? So that's just part of the background of what's going on here. Now, with stable harvests, basically what we're seeing is that timber share of GDP. GDP is gross domestic product. It's a measure that economists use to measure the total commercial and industrial output. So this is all of the output of governments and businesses. And basically, we see that in the 1960s, that used to be about 10 to 12%. But beginning about in the mid-1970s, it's gone down. And it is now, at about 2009 on the far right, it was about 1% of the total output of the state's economy. The different colors reflect the fact that the federal government changed its system of collecting data. And so economists within the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis have had to adjust the new data to be compatible. And that's the red line extension there. And you see that there's just a long-run decline. Now, there's no surprise there, because basically you have the wood products industry, which has been reasonably stable or even declining if you talk about log exports, while the rest of the economy has grown. So there's no magic there. It's pretty understandable what's going on there. At the same time, we have timber jobs have shrunk. Now, a couple of things. This is a pretty complex graph, and I apologize for that, but that's just the reality that we have. We go from 1950, 60, 70, 80, 90 to 2010. And we see that historically we're up around 70 to 80,000 jobs within the lumber and wood products industry. But beginning in about the mid-1980s, where it starts to go down, we started to see a decline in employment within this industry. There are a lot of reasons for that decline. Oh, by the way, the different colors, again, that's a change in data collection. That's all that's going on there. A lot of reasons for that. Some of it's technology, some of it is different markets, different products, the introduction of plywood and oriented strand board and the like. So there's a lot of things going on there. But there's really a distinctive thing that happened in the mid-1980s. And what that thing was is that the industry, as part of the Reagan Revolution, broke the ability of the unions to be as strong as they had been in past. So yeah, there are still some unions out there in the industry, but they have nowhere near the strength that they had until about the mid-1980s. As a consequence of that, whether you have new technology, new products, whatever, holding all of those things constant, the industry had a greater ability to reduce its labor force. And so we see this downward trend. The total employment within the wood products industry right now is around 30,000, something like that. Okay, so we've gone from about 70 down to 30. And again, this was parallel with what we're talking about in terms of the industry's role within GDP. Not surprisingly, as you see this decline in employment, we see that the number of jobs per log is declining. Now, it went up a little bit in the 1990s, and basically all that was going on there is that you had mills that had an employment, they had a processing production function going on, but you had a reduction in federal harvests. And so there was a transition period, and as you had a decline in harvest, they hadn't quite laid off all of the workers, or the laying off of workers didn't catch up until about 2000. And so what we see is that we continue to see the employment per log declining. Now, all of these declines, as far as I know, there's no reason for us to expect those trends downward to do anything other than continue. And I want to make it clear. When I say that, I'm not saying the industry is bad. I'm not saying the industry is good. I'm not making any judgments about this at all. I'm merely saying that that's what's happening out there within the industry. Here's what we expect to see. This is a forecast from the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. This is their 19th February forecast to the legislature. So this is the next to the final official state forecast. And you see, again, the role of what they expect happening in wood products. A decline of 200 jobs over the next 17 years. Next 7 years, rather. Versus an overall increase of 277,000 jobs within the state. So part of the message of all of these slides is that this is not the driver of Oregon's economy the way that many of us remember that it was as we were growing up. Again, I'm not saying it's a bad industry, I'm not saying whatever, I'm just saying that relative to the rest of what's going on in this state, it's not sitting in the driver's seat. This graph, I think, is one of the most important ones that I have up there. This graph shows what happens to the real wages, or the average wages. Real means that you're adjusting for inflation. So they're all in 2010 dollars. Now the blue line shows the average wage for the state of Oregon. And it's been roughly around $40,000 per worker per year over this extended period from the mid-1970s. Again, this is adjusted for inflation. We know that it's gone up with inflation. The red line is what's happened in the wood products industry. And if we go back into the 1970s, 1980s, the wood products industry workers received a premium relative to all other workers of about 30%. Well, how is it that they were able to do that? Well, it goes back to what I talked about before. They had very powerful unions. And so the unions were able to look at all of the money being made off of the timber industry, and they were able to grab their share of it. With the busting of the unions, the massive decline in their power, the industry as a whole was able to take that money back to the corporations. So that by the time we get to 2008, 2009, 2010, you see that the average wage in the timber industry is very near the average wage for all workers in the state. And there's even a couple of years there where it was slightly below the average for the state as a whole. So we want to be very careful when we're talking about the relationship and the ability of managing forests to generate high-paying, stable jobs, that we look forward, or we look at where we are and look forward rather than look in our past, because in our past, we see that there was this wage premium, and that wage premium just simply doesn't exist any longer.
You say those wages are adjusted for inflation, so really in 1976, a timber worker wasn't making more than $50,000?
Yeah, if you adjust for inflation, if you adjust for inflation, all of the left-hand side goes way down, okay? And that we adjust for inflation so that it's easy to compare across the years and see what's sort of fundamentally going on versus what's happened with just the effects of inflation. Now, the bottom right tells us, so what is the loss to Oregon and Josephine County? Basically, what I've done here is you have about $40,000 per worker. A 30% premium would be about $12,000. So what I'm looking at is what would have happened, or what would we have today if the workers were still able to get this 30% premium? And if we look for Josephine County, you take that $12,000 per worker per year times the number of workers, and it adds up to about $8 million. So the busting of the unions and the ability of the corporations to take that money back from workers is costing, everything else equal, is costing Josephine County workers about $8 million a year. For the state as a whole, it's costing workers within the industry about $330 million a year. Right? And part of this is again, just to say, these decisions have consequences, and we do not have the industry today that we had when I worked in it and when my parents worked in it. Now, at the same time that the timber industry was able to reach into workers' paychecks and take money out, the industry in this state was able to reach into county coffers and take money back from the counties. If we go back historically, Oregon, Washington, and California all had a timber harvest tax. And there are a lot of ways to think about this, but basically the argument was, the cynical view was you had an awful lot of trees that are really valuable, so let's tax them because it's easier than taxing anything else. Okay, there's some merit to that. A less cynical view is that you are changing the resources that a community has, that the state has, and as you change that, we want to share that bounty. So part of the bounty went to the corporations, Part of the bounty went to the workers, part of the bounty went to the communities. And basically it was, the social license to operate was going on here. Well, what this graph talks about is the consequence of 1993, when all of the brouhaha was going on with spotted owls. The timber industry in Oregon persuaded the Oregon legislature to phase out the Oregon timber harvest tax. So there is now no longer an Oregon timber harvest tax that delivers any money to general purpose governments, to counties, to the state agencies, whatever. So we're trying to now simulate what would happen if Oregon had Washington's tax or California's tax. And why is that interesting? Well, that's interesting because we have industries, we have corporations that operate in Oregon and operate in Washington. As far as I know, they're making money in both places. Or they're operating in Oregon, they're operating in California, they're making money in both places. So we're trying to talk about what is the effect of the corporation's ability to reach in and take that money back from local and state governments. Now, the purple, let's start there. If you look on the books, Oregon technically has a timber harvest tax, and it generates about $10 million a year. But all of that money goes from the industry's left pocket into the industry's right pocket. Because all of that money goes to pay for the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, which is the public relations arm of the industry. It pays for some professors in the forest practices departments of Oregon State University. It goes to pay for some of the enforcement of the Oregon Forest Practices Act, the regulations that govern logging, and it goes to pay for some of the costs of fighting fire. So all of that basically is supporting the operations of the timber industry. The red line is what the ONC counties, the western counties of Oregon, would have received if we had had California's tax. And so you go over to the right, and it's about $30,000, right? Midway between 20 and 40. Or $1 million, $1 million. The reality is that a year ago, California actually bumped their tax up. So it would be more on the order of $40 million now, given their system. The green is Washington. So what the ONC counties would have received if we had Washington's tax. And in particular, the blue dotted line, because Washington's system dedicates 4/5 of the money to counties. The money must go to counties. Can't stop at the state. So over on the right, it's about $40 million. So if we had Washington's system, the Josephine County, Jackson County, Douglas County, Coos, Curry, all the way up, the Columbia River would be receiving about $40 million a year from a timber harvest tax. We don't receive that, again, because the corporations, the industry had enough power in the legislature in 1993 to, in effect, reach in and say, we want that money, we're going to take it away from the counties. Put all of this together, and it is part and parcel of what I think all of you probably heard about, because it's getting an awful lot of attention from politicians of all stripes. And this growing inequality of incomes within the United States. And I used to think, in my naivete, that this was basically between most Americans and Wall Street. And so they had, these barons of Wall Street making all these billions and bazillions of dollars, and the rest of us are pretty much out there the same. Well, the reality is that it applies within Oregon's boundaries exactly the same. So what this chart shows, is put together by the Oregon Employment Department, is they went and looked at workers who worked 4 quarters, that meant they're full-time workers, in 1990. And they traced those workers to 2012. And again, with the adjustment for inflation, they said, what happened? What they find is that the workers that had the lowest 20% saw their incomes go down by about 7% over that period. The second and middle 20% saw their incomes go down more than 10%. The second highest, again, it's about 7%. The only ones who made money, the only ones who saw their incomes go up over this period were people who were in the upper 20%. And it's really, really the people who are in the top 1%. So what we see happening at a national level is happening within within Oregon as well. Now, all of those previous charts are entirely consistent with this. Because you have workers who used to have stable, high-paying jobs in the timber industry have now lost their jobs, many of them, from 70,000 down to 30,000. The ones that remained saw their incomes go down, right, from a 30% premium to no premium at all. And there's no longer money being circulated back through county courthouses from the timber industry to help support jobs there as well. I'm not saying that the timber industry is the only cause of this. I'm saying it's entirely consistent with what we see going on. With the passage or the adoption of the Northwest Forest Plan in 1994, sociologists in this part of the world, I mean, this was their dream. You're going to have this big threshold that economies and local communities are going to crow across. And so it's going to have to change what happens out there in the social well-being of these communities. And the general hypothesis was that as the the level of logging on federal lands diminished with the adoption of the forest plan, that you would have just chaos and ruin and despicable things happen. And so you had sociologists running all over Josephine County and Jackson County and Northern California, checking out what happened. You know, PhD dissertation after PhD dissertation. In 2000, the National Research Council summarized all that literature. And it was a stunning finding. I remember when this report came out, and it was truly just that. People sort of slapping the fronts of their foreheads. It was just the opposite. What that research found was that in communities that had a higher concentration of workers employed in the timber industry, you had a higher level of these characteristics over here. The stunning lasted only for just a nanosecond or so, because we know that this is characteristic of other resource extractive industries. You go to any mining area, and you see very much the same thing. Okay? And to a great extent, the timber industry was operating at that time very much like a mining industry. You know, there's a resource there, let's extract it as rapidly as we can. So what are the implications here? Here's what I believe all of those charts tell us. That more logging will not stimulate economic growth. It is simply too small an industry to do very much. And as I'll talk about later, it has adverse consequences as well. So it's not all positive. Will it generate stable and high-wage jobs? No. There is no evidence out there that it will do that. Now, it's always possible, I suppose, that they're going to turn over a leaf, and instead of letting workers go, they're going to hire more workers, or they're going to, instead of diminishing wages, they're going to increase wages. But, an awful lot of economic research plus my own good sense and skepticism says, no, that's just not going to happen. And I want to make it very clear. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's a reality. So as we're talking about what we should do with these forests, and we want to accomplish those things of economic growth and good jobs, there's a very low probability that that's going to happen if you try to do this through logging. But, maybe it's the only thing we've got. If it's the only thing that you got, well, then you go out and do it. So is there a better alternative? Yes, there is. The term that economists use is amenity-driven growth. This is a map that shows between 2000 and 2010 the net migration rate. So the number of new people moving into a county minus the number of people who moved out. Red means more people moved out than moved in. Purple means more moved in than moved out. Now, we've seen this pattern for a very long time, and we've especially seen it since about the mid-1960s. And that was an important event when we started to figure out that this was going on, because until that time, I mean, this goes all the way back to Adam Smith in 1776, there was a powerful belief that the only way that a community's economy could grow basically was, build it and they will come model, known more formally as jobs first and then people will follow. So you had, a county, Josephine County, or the city of Grants Pass, the Chamber of Commerce, going out and trying to attract money to come in to build a new mill or a new plant or a new business into town. And I'm sure that you all have seen economic development policies that have that model. And let's try to attract new business. And the theory is that if you attract a new business, create jobs, then people will move to town to fill the jobs. So jobs first, people follow. What we started to see in the mid-1960s is just the opposite. We started to see that people would move to a place not having a job, not having the promise of a job, or even the prospect of a job, but they would move to a place and eventually the jobs would follow them. So this is a people first, jobs follow mechanism of economic growth. Well, how did that happen? Well, the easy explanation is that we started to see the interstate system develop. We started to see the baby boomers get old enough. And we started to see the people go on vacation, and then they come back and they say, honey, I can't stand it here anymore. We had such a great time. Why don't we go back up there and see if we can't make a go of it? And sure enough, they do. And so what we see is over on the left-hand side of Oregon and Washington, no surprise at all to anybody who lives in Oregon, that that's where people are moving to. Surveys that have been done of people who move to Oregon and turn in their driver's license for several years. I was part of an organization that surveyed these people. And we'd ask them, well, why'd you come? More than half, about about three-quarters would say quality of life. We'd say, well, do you have a job? About half of them would say no. I said, well, what do you expect is going to happen to your income? It's probably going to go down. Well, again, until we started to understand this process, that was just inconsistent with all economic theory, because people would not move to an area to see their incomes go down. They would move only to get an increase in income. But what we find is that people are increasingly moving to have a quality of life, to have access to amenities, and that's as important as the job. And what we find is very, very hard to distinguish between these two. But the best research that's been done says that those two mechanisms are about 50-50. That if you look at the growth in a state, you can explain half of that growth by the jobs first model, and you explain half of that by the people first model. So there's no surprise that you would see economic growth happening in purple areas. This is another way of thinking about it. This is work that was just done by the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis, and I think it's really quite innovative. What it does is it looks at three sort of major areas: the Corn Belt, the Rust Belt, and the Timber Belt, and looks at 1980 and 2012. And on the left-hand side, it looks at the jobs in manufacturing and farming as a share of the total. And so in the Corn Belt, it was 40%, it's dropped down to about 20. The Rust Belt, it was almost 30, it's dropped down to about 12. In the Timber Belt, it was more than 30, it's dropped down to about 15. So what we see is that jobs in these areas, sort of big manufacturing, big farming, is declining as a share of the total. Well, we saw that earlier. That's happening with timber here. But in contrast, look on the right-hand side, the population growth between those periods. Very little population growth in the Corn Belt, at the Midwest. Very little in the Rust Belt, and boom, in the Timber Belt. Western Washington, Western Oregon, Northern California. Well, another way to think about this is that our economy used to be heavily oriented towards farming and manufacturing, muscular work. Right now, our economy is very heavily oriented on what's between your ears and how you use it. Talent is more important than muscle. And so our ability to attract talent on that previous map helps explain how the economy of Oregon is growing at all. Because otherwise you would have expected us to have the same experience as the Corn Belt and the Rust Belt. And, believe me, Portland is a lot better than Detroit. So there's some real implications, some real powerful implications from this. There's sort of a belief that, that's sort of Portland. They even got a TV show. But it's especially important right here. This is work done by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and it looks at the correlation between job and income growth with what they call amenities. Nice things. Now, some of this is natural resource. Some of this is entertainment. Ashland plays a big role in this. Some of it is museums. What you have here in Josephine County plays a role in this. But there's a real correlation between you have more amenities here and you attract more people here. And you go out and talk to your neighbors, I bet you that you will find that they're living here because they like to live here. Not because, it's a hell of a place to live, but at least we got a job. This is not Ohio. This is not Nebraska. Well, all of this people moving in. The direct effects are really important. And one way to look at the direct effects on the economy is to look at outdoor recreation. And this chart looks at existing jobs, the timber industry, and the outdoor recreation industry. So the timber industry, remember the earlier slide, is about 25 to 30,000 workers. The outdoor recreation industry in this state is 140,000 workers. Okay, I didn't know that until a couple years ago. Then look at the new jobs. Start down at the bottom. The outdoor recreation industry during the Great Recession was continuing to add, or they estimated that they were adding about 7,000 jobs per year. So that's an industry that was continuing to add jobs throughout the Great Recession. Well, that's entirely consistent with people moving here. It really is. But now what about the timber industry? I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here and look at the draft resource management plan and environmental impact statement that the BLM just published 2 weeks ago. In their preferred alternative, right, they're going to increase logging. They will create, they say, 1,827 jobs. Sidebar. Whenever an agency like that says 1,827, ask them, why wasn't it 1,826? How do you know? That's just false precision. They don't know that. So they're just playing with numbers. Okay, 1,800, yeah, I can get that. That sounds about right. But not 27. Give me a break. But what's even more important is that even if it is 1,827 exactly on the dime this year, what's going to happen to the number of jobs next year? It's going to go down. Right? So that's part of what's going on. Now, in contrast, what do you think is going to happen with the outdoor recreation industry? You think the number of jobs there is going to go down? My bet is it's going to go up. It just simply is. So back to my very first slide, the relationship between forests. How can we manage forests to get more jobs, to stimulate economic growth? Part of what I'm showing you here is some of the alternatives that we actually have. Now, previous slide was all about the direct effects. Okay, forests, directly employing people to go out there and have a good time in forests. This slide says that the indirect effects are even far, far, far more important. This comes from research done at the University of North Carolina. They surveyed people who make decisions within corporations of where they're going to locate their firms. They focus on the high technology firms, and those firms increasingly make their decisions on where to locate based on quality of life. Why is that? Let me give you an example. Where I used to work in Eugene, we had a corporation, small company move in right next door to us. computer firm. A couple of guys moved up out of Silicon Valley, started their own firm. And we eventually figured out what they're doing was computer games, video games, so you can argue whether there's any social merit to what they did. But at least in terms of my son, it was delightful. Okay? Those two guys said that they could compete with their former colleagues back in Silicon Valley precisely because they could attract workers to Eugene and pay them less because the workers wanted to live in Eugene because they could go in the mountains and ski, they could be at the coast in an hour, they could be out on the rivers, the air was clean. That set of amenities then was the competitive advantage that that firm had compared to its competitors in San Jose. And if you think about it, if you've been in San Jose, well, you understand that immediately. You do. So this is what's really going on. We attract talent. That's what this slide is about. Is we can attract talent, and the industries within, or the corporations within the high-tech industry are saying that that's exactly right. And here's what that means. Well, let's look on the left. This shows Oregon's employment. This is work that was just done by the Oregon Office of Employment of Economic Analysis between 1976 and 2014. And on the left, it's employment. The dark blue line is that timber industry line that I showed before. All right, it was up around 70, 80. It's down now. This one shows 40. It says forest sector instead of timber industry, and there's a distinction there, so they're adding more people in. But we're down around 30. So that's that line that went down. In contrast, the light blue line is the high-tech industry, and it's gone from about 20,000 to up around 90,000 up there, high-tech, number of workers. But the stunner is the right-hand graph. The bottom of that graph shows the forest sector and Oregon sector real average wages per worker, right, with the premium in the forest sector, and it gradually now, all of that premium is gone. So they're around, that one says 45,000 again, because they've added more workers in there. But look at that other line, the high-tech line. The average worker in the high-tech industry in Oregon earns $100,000. So think about that. If we can manage our forests to get one high-tech worker, that one high-tech worker is worth more than 2 workers within the timber industry. And what direction are the lines going? So if you're going to make your bet on the future, what should we be trying to do? What all of this says is, can we manage forest amenities so that we attract more talent, so that we get more high-paying jobs, so that we have more economic growth, and we have more of these really good family wage jobs? So these two graphs basically summarize all that I've been talking about so far. Another part of it is to attract baby boomer income. Okay? Because all of us that are part of the baby boomer generation, we're either retired or we're getting to retire, and we're going to have incomes not from our labor, but from transfer payments, non-labor income. This graph shows by county for 2010 the percent of total income in each county that was non-labor income. And I apologize, it's a really difficult graph. On the far side, it shows the United States. So here's the United States here. And we're up around 30%. So for the U.S. as a whole, about 30% of all income comes from, say, retirement, or from dividends from investments, or from rent, because you own property and you collect rent. You're not working for it, so it's non-labor income. If you look over here in the O&C region, it's higher than that, and every one of these counties is higher. That's Josephine. Now, is anybody surprised by that? You shouldn't be. Because what happens in the Rogue River Valley? You have an awful lot of people here who are retire, or they're investors, up out of California, whatever. They have non-labor income. So here, again, you're not trying to manage the forest in order to get some sort of job that's directly associated with trees and cutting them down or doing whatever. It's trying to attract people who can bring income to your community simply because they want to live here. And oh, how I wish the BLM would have paid attention to all of this, but it simply hasn't. This compares two alternatives, and I'll talk more about these alternatives later, but the preferred alternative, which they call B, as in boy, has more than 210,000 acres for timber. There's another alternative, D, had only 160. The relationship is reversed for recreation. So they chose the alternative with more timber, less recreation. When I believe that in terms of if you want to manage those forests in order to accomplish those goals of stimulating economic growth and creating good, high-paying jobs, that's the wrong direction to go in. Again, I'm not saying what my preference is. I'm just saying that's, you have all of those graphs going down. That says they're going to go up. It's hard for me to see how that's going to work. And it has a real impact here. This is information from the Oregon Employment Department. These are projections for the Rogue Valley, 2012, next 10 years. It shows that overall they expected total growth to grow 12,000 new jobs in those 10 years, and a 14% growth. Well, they are also expecting mining and logging and wood products to grow, 10, 12%. That's a pretty big percentage increase. But how many workers is it? Can't even see it on the graph. On the other side, you have leisure and hospitality, all right, associated with recreation, professional business services and healthcare. That sort of talent, okay? What kind of doctors, what kind of healthcare do you want here? Do you want talented folks? You want not so talented? Those are big numbers. And so basically, if you're going to manage Josephine County's forests, do you want to manage them to try to get wood products to grow 12% instead of 10%? Or you want to try to manage it to get leisure, business services, and healthcare to grow another 2%? That's the sort of choice that you're making right here. BLM has made a choice saying that they're going to emphasize wood products manufacturing. There are consequences of that decision. Part of the consequences will be, yes, it'll boost that 10% up, maybe a little bit, 1,827 jobs, and Josephine County's share of that, which isn't very big. Or you could try to manage that in order to attract new talent in, say, your healthcare industry. Could it be the lobbies from the timber industry who affect the BLM decision? I'm not smart enough to know the answer to that, but I bet you do. Are you biased, a hired gun? Well, I'm definitely not hired by anybody to do this. Am I biased? Probably, because I think everybody is. My bias, however, is exactly on the economics, right? What I've presented there are facts. If you don't like the interpretation of the facts, that's fine. You interpret them some other way. I'd be really surprised to see if you can come up with a different explanation. Really would be surprised. Really interested. But you don't get to choose different facts. And that really is what's happening in the timber industry. That really is what's happening in recreation and the like. Those are just numbers. Okay, there was only one graph, or only one chart there, and that was numbers that I pulled out of BLM. Okay, all of the other, those are numbers that other people put together, not my numbers. The question here of defining sustainable logging, it's not my gig. You need to talk to somebody else who knows that. Are standing forests worth more than farms and ranches? Talk about that a little bit. Not so much farms and ranches, but benefits and costs. That's what that question is all about. Have you looked at the social economic portion of the new BLM DEIS for Western Oregon? I've looked at some of that. What do I think of the analysis? I'm going to get into that. What are the costs of increased population growth on ecosystem services? Excellent question. Excellent question. Because if you do attract more people here, yeah, it's going to put more stress on the forests. So let me pose the question. So does that mean we should cut the forest down so more people don't move here in order so that we don't stress the ecosystem? Okay, I understand the issue and I think it's a really important issue, but in terms of the decisions that we make, it's another level of issue, a decision that we need to have. Is there a correlation between increased population, loss of ecosystem services, and poverty? Yeah, there is. Yeah, there are things going on there. Are there examples or studies that show stable or shrinking populations and healthy economy and stable or improved ecosystem values? Yeah, there are. One of the sort of most immediate examples of that is large military bases. Right? They clear all the people out. Boy, those are really healthy places. One of the international examples is Chernobyl. Moved all the people out. You have all kinds of critters out there living there now. No, they glow in the dark, but, got a lot of critters. Okay. Is the main reason behind BLM's choice of B over D? You have to talk to BLM about that. Again, I'm not advocating one or the other. When you talk of jobs, do you mean full-time jobs with benefits, or do you lump all jobs, full and part-time? I believe that in one of the graphs on the inequality, they made very clear that it was people who worked 4 quarters in a year. All the others basically are taking a snapshot of what the workers are. So there's a percentage that's full-time, percentage that's part-time, and that's just part of the data. One of the reasons for that is that if you don't do that, then you have to go into that snapshot and dig around through it, and it's really hard. And so there isn't an awful lot of work that goes beyond that.
A lot of people say that recreational jobs are part-time. That's all.
Yeah, there are recreational jobs that are part-time. There are differences between those jobs. There certainly are. The industry, well, actually, the industry and BLM, and you can see the industry's information within the DEIS. They report that the average job in the recreation industry is half of what it is in the timber industry, or in their forest sector. There's other information out there, particular work that's been done for Travel Oregon by a firm called Dean Runyon and Associates that focuses on county-by-county basis. And yeah, you can have in the leisure and hospitality industry right next to the freeway, and those are pretty low-paying jobs. If you go out and look at the jobs in the recreation industry associated with Oregon caves, the wages associated with that are almost exactly the same as what you find in the timber industry. So there's some real variation there. Where are most logs exported to? My understanding now is that most of them go to China. What was the rationale for the reduction of the timber harvest tax? That owl is going to kill us. You have to give us a lifeline, otherwise we are going to go down. And if we go down, the entire economy of the state of Oregon is going to go down into the sewer. That basically was the argument that the industry gave to the legislature in 1993. The quality of life amenities that attract retirees and tech industry also give my property more value. Is there an economist around here? Whoever wrote that? Because that's exactly right. Yeah. People move in. What happens to the value of your property? We have more demand. Basic economics. Demand goes up. What happens to prices? Okay. Do you have any information that estimates how the timber harvest will reduce our property values? There is some research that's been done looking at what happens in communities that are very near to federal lands versus very near to private lands. I haven't looked at that recently. Generally, we know what to expect out there. You know, all else equal, the closer you are to a clear cut with a stream going by with mud in the water and no fish, compared to exactly the same house with a forested hillside, clean water, and salmon in the fish. Yeah. Let's move on. Benefits and costs. What do I mean? I mean value. Okay? So we take something that has some value, we use it up in order to create something new that has value. What we get out of that process is called benefits. What we use up is called cost. Pretty simple context, okay? But it's not really exactly the same as what is the cost when you go into Walmart and buy something. So this is the fundamental. You use something up, you get something new. One is the cost, one is the benefit. So let's think about that. And in particular, I want to talk about carbon. I want to talk about carbon in large part because, again, as an economist, I believe this is the most important issue that faces us right now. What do we mean? The map comes from the National Climate Assessment, and it shows the temperature change since the beginning of the 20th century. And basically, it's about 0.85 degrees Celsius. So it's a little bit, a degree and a half Fahrenheit. So we see that the temperatures have gone up across a large part of the United States, including right here. All right? I expect most of you know that because you've got more hotter days in this area. There's an area that can get smoking hot. The right, okay, the map is looking backwards. The right is a graph looking forward, and that comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it compares two scenarios. The top scenario is what happens if we continue basically doing what we're doing. And that particular graph is the emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but if you convert that into temperature, it goes right up the same. And basically what they have projected is that if we stay on that upper graph, that upper line, the total temperature, average temperature, will go up another 4 degrees Celsius. And at that point, as I understand the science, all bets are off. And what does climate change mean? It means an increase in average temperature. It means a change in precipitation. Some places get wetter, some places get hotter. Some places around here will get more of our rain and more of our precipitation as rain rather than as snow. Okay, most of you heard this story, right? It means an increase in the frequency and the severity of extreme events, droughts, storms, and the like, insect infestations and the like, heat waves that kill grandmas and kids. Okay. We actually have seen this in Oregon and Washington already, an increase in heat waves, more people dying. And we don't think we have this, but we actually do. Talking about drought, we have a 4-year drought in Oregon right now. As I was driving down, Oregon Public Broadcasting was talking about, or maybe it was Jefferson Public Radio was talking about, if you drive across Oregon from west to east, geez, look at how dry it is. Okay, so we're there, all right? And it changes in ecosystems. Okay, so you get more bugs. You get, one of the questions was, forests are moving, forests that we have in this environment can no longer tolerate the heat. We can't tolerate the aridity. So on the left-hand side, we have the atmosphere and the tree growing, and the tree takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and converts it into wood. Pretty simple. It sequesters carbon is the topic, or is the term, and it stores carbon. So it stores carbon in the stem and in the roots, and in the litter that's around. You go out and walk around an old-growth forest, you see an awful lot of dead wood lying around. Now the right-hand side says, well, what happens as you cut that tree down? Well, in this region, given the technology that we have right now, as soon as you cut down that tree, about 1/4 of the carbon that's stored there is going to go into the atmosphere fairly quickly. Think about slash burning. Okay, it goes up into the atmosphere fairly quickly. About another 1/4 will go into the atmosphere over time as that log goes to the mill. You have sawdust. The sawdust is burned. So about another 1/4 of it. And then over time of the wood products that you have, that one shows 2x4s, but an awful lot of it is also paper. So over time, an awful lot of those wood products also will rot, and the carbon will go into the atmosphere. So over several decades, 3/4 of the carbon that is stored in that tree will go into the atmosphere. That's why trees are important. They can either pull carbon dioxide out, or if you already have a tree, you can release it back up. And why are the trees here important, especially trees on federal lands? This graph shows it's the Forest Service, but basically BLM is the same as the Forest Service. They, of course, will argue about that, but basically it's the same. And the height of the green bar is the total carbon tons per acre. Every national forest in the United States. And the highest bars are right here. As I understand the research, the forests that we have from Northern California, basically the redwoods, extending all the way up on western side to the Canadian border, has the highest density of carbon per acre of almost any ecosystem in the world. People argue this, argue that, but basically this has the highest concentration of carbon stored sitting out there on the sun. So trees that already exist, if you cut them down, 3/4 of that carbon is going to go into the air. So this really is a big deal. You know, we don't have very many carbon or coal-fired power plants here putting carbon dioxide in the air, but we have basically a green version of a coal-fired power plant as soon as we start cutting those trees down. Now, measuring the importance. I suspect that you have struggled at climate change, and there are indicators of, like I just said, 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit or another 4 degrees Celsius. What does that mean? I don't know how to weigh that. I don't know how to measure it. Well, this is what economics does. It tries to put value on things so that people can have a better sense of, is this more important than that? How big is it? How big is the importance? Well, the Interagency Working Group, and basically a dozen federal agencies, put their economists into a room and said, go through all of the professional literature. What does it tell us is the cost of the damage per ton of carbon dioxide that goes up into the atmosphere? All right, so you put a ton of carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere, it's going to increase drought, it's going to increase the number of people killed from heat stress and the like. Estimated. Well, actually, one agency didn't participate. Guess which one? Interior, which is BLM. Might explain some of what happens now. So these are numbers that came up. You don't really need to know about the numbers because I'll go through some of them. But the point is that they use models, and so they model what's going to happen as this carbon dioxide goes up in the atmosphere over time. And then they look at the average, and that's the middle column. But the thing with climate change is that it's a risk. And when you're dealing with risky things, you want to pay attention not just to our average expectations, but what happens if things really go bad. Right? When you buy a house, you think, yeah, I probably can pay. But you probably also think, but geez, if I lose my job, so maybe you ought to buy a little cheaper house. Okay? Same sort of thing. And you see that basically they add up all of the model runs, and then they look at the averages in the middle. The 95th percentile is 5 from the top. So these are where things really turn out bad. And you see that the numbers go up from emissions in 2015, it's 32 per ton, or 89. But emissions in 2050, it's, push those numbers up. And why is that? It's because the more you get greenhouse gases up there, the bigger the effect. And the more we start seeing bad things happen. So this is where we begin. And I'll give BLM credit. They put this information in there. And to my knowledge, they're the only forest management agency that's done this. So I give them an awful lot of credit for doing this. This compares the alternatives B and D. B, as in boy, is their preferred alternative. So they show that this is in millions of dollars. Carbon storage for B is 165 million. Timber value is 72, 237 million. D, more carbon storage, less timber value, bigger net, bigger total. Well, if this is all that BLM was concerned about, why wouldn't they choose D? It has a bigger total number. By the way, these are the average numbers. So they're saying, let's assume that things are going to play out pretty much as we expect. Let's forget about this risk stuff, that things could really go bad. This is one way to think about it. Now, they clearly looked at this and they said, well, we would rather have 237.9 than 270 because we choose B. Setting aside, the economics is why? What is it that is so important that you would prefer 237.9 to 270.2?
Excuse me, what does carbon storage mean first?
This is the amount of carbon that they would store. All right, so each year they would store this amount of carbon. Each year they would cut that amount of timber. Okay?
As a live tree, carbon storage.
As carbon storage. Yeah. Okay. So trees out there that they don't cut suck carbon dioxide down. You put that value per ton. So you count the number of tons that it sucks out. value per ton, get the numbers. What's really important, though, if you want to analyze this, is they've made their decision. They said B rather than D. So let's compare the two. Let's subtract D from B. So let's look at what is the net gain that they think they got with B. And then let's see what happens. So if you compare those, B minus D, they get an additional 36 million of timber benefits. They cut more trees. They give up carbon because they store less carbon. So that's a cost of 68 million. So the ratio of costs to benefits is 2. A little bit different than that, but again, you round it off. Ratio of costs to benefits is 2. Going from D to their preferred alternative. But this is BLM's calculation with the average numbers. These are average numbers in 2012. What they failed to account for is information in the scientific literature since then. And in particular, research that was completed and published in January of this year, so it was months ago, they had time to account for this, that basically said, this new research says, the numbers that you calculated in 2012, they're off by a factor of 6. Okay? The issue there is that in 2012, all the economists were able to measure is the damage from the storms and from droughts and the like. But they basically made a simplifying assumption and said, but we'll recover from it. But the reality is we won't. When we spend $1 billion cleaning up after Superstorm Sandy, that's $1 billion we don't have to build new cars or build new video games or whatever. So our economic growth goes down. When you take into account that economic growth, it multiplies by 6. And that's what you have here. So that carbon dioxide that they don't suck out when they go from D to B is now 410 million. And the ratio of cost to benefits is 12. BLM doesn't account for that. And then if you're concerned about that risk, that 95th percentile, it's 1,200,000,000. And the ratio is 34. So when they choose B rather than D, they are disregarding costs that exceed the benefits of that switch by 34 to 1. Or another way to think about that is that every $1,000 of logs going down the road that they sell to the industry, $1,000 worth of logs, that's the benefit. Somebody's paying a cost, probably of $12 million, $12,000, and maybe $34,000. Go talk to ranchers in Eastern Oregon. Go talk to farmers in California. Go talk to cities that are in California, they're going to have to invest in new water infrastructure. That's what we're talking about. These are real costs. And the BLM, in effect, is saying, in order to get that little bit of timber, 36 million, we're going to impose these other costs on everybody else. And that's cool. That's their decision. So this is how the economics gets to some of those questions that you asked. This is how you start to sort through this. You look at the decision that they made, the decision that they didn't make. Right? So they rejected D, they chose B. Well, what about, these are benefits. What about jobs? Going from D to B will give an additional 744 jobs. Right, so when they reject D, choose B, 744 jobs. The cost, that's the same number. So the cost per job is $91,000. That's using the BLM's own number. Right, so the carbon cost per job is $91,000. What's the average wage in that industry? About $40,000. All right? But now we account for the cost, the new research that they didn't account for, and it's $547,000 a job. And then you say, what if things really turn out bad? It's $1.6 million per job. Now, BLM's making that choice. They say we want to get jobs, and so we're going to cut more timber to get jobs. But they ought to account for those costs if you're really trying to do this weighing of the risks versus the benefits. Well, another thing, so we've looked at benefits, the timber versus the carbon damage. We've looked at jobs. Another concern here is county payments. And BLM is very explicit about this. They want to cut more timber to get more money to the counties. The additional county payments to O&C counties, all of the counties, so it's not just Josephine, is $17.7 million a year. The carbon cost is going to be 68, so for every dollar that the counties will get, somebody's going to, by the BLM's own calculation, somebody's going to pay $4 in costs. And it might be you, because you might have a heat wave, and it might be somebody you know that gets sick and dies. You correct for the research published this year that they didn't account for, so it's current research. It goes to $23 per dollar. And if you look at things really go bad on us, it's $68 of cost somewhere for every dollar of new county payments. So if you want to understand the decisions that people are making, they're weighing, are they in fact saying that $1 of new county revenue is worth sticking it to somebody else for $68? So, just to summarize here. Stimulate economic growth, generate high-wage jobs? No. Will the benefits exceed the costs? No on federal lands. Okay, I'm not talking private lands, I'm not talking state lands. I can do that some other place, but I'm not doing that tonight. Focusing on this. That's where we end up. Going all the way back to my first slide. If you want to manage the forest to get these things, will logging do that for you? Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.